You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 28th of May, 2025 on Monocle Radio.
Ukraine hopes for peace but braces for a summer offensive. Australia's conservative opposition breaks up and then makes up. And which type of annoying airline passenger would you find if you had the choice? I'm Chris Chermak. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. My guests Marie Lecomte and Justin Quirk will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll hear from a former British diplomat taking on the UK's broken asylum system. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily, and I'm joined today by Marie Lecomte, political journalist and author, and Justin Quirk, writer and editor. Good evening to both of you.
Hi.
Good to have you both here. We're going to start with a little bit of travel news. Justin, you've been traveling. You've been in Palma.
Moderately successful trip. Palma itself was great, as always. I think it was my 9th or 10th visit. Then foolishly went up the coast a few miles, which was a place I've been recommended. It was very near the Joan Miro house, which was my main reason for going there. The Miro house is fantastic. The surrounding area, not so much. So I would advise, stay in Palma if you're in that neck of the woods.
I think you're going to have to get some advice from our editor-in-chief, Andrew Tuck, who I know spends a lot of time in Parma. So you can chat with him afterwards about all the opportunities to see in Mallorca. You've also been traveling, Marie, but you've been in Rome, and you're kind of wishing you were a solo traveler right now from what you were saying.
Yes, it was absolutely lovely. So my brother and I took our mum to Rome for her 60th birthday. It was a lovely kind of Christmas surprise. And it was, incredibly fun. But yes, I usually go on holiday by myself. And suddenly kind of, ironically found myself to sort of be the mum of the trip. I had, I'd booked the restaurants and I had to be the one going, putting my coat on and kind of waiting by the door going, we really have to check out of the Airbnb now. I'm the one with the bank account tied to this. So no, it was absolutely lovely, but also I definitely feel like I came back, perhaps less relaxed than I'd been actually when I left London for Rome.
It's that thing of needing a holiday from the holiday, isn't it? But instead you're here. Does this feel like a holiday?
There's nothing I could dream of that would compare to being in the studio.
Yeah, well, we're not going to start with some happy news, I'm afraid. We are starting with Ukraine, where President Volodymyr Zelensky has been on a visit to Berlin. He said he was open to a summit between him, President Vladimir Putin, and Donald Trump to agree a ceasefire after nearly 3 years of war. Flying in the face of any suggestion of a ceasefire are reports that some 50,000 troops are amassing near Ukraine's Sumy region in the northeast, preparing for what Zelensky calls a summer offensive. Marie, I wanted to start with these suggestions of a summit. There have been one round of direct talks between Ukraine and Russia. Would that get us anywhere at this point?
I'm not convinced. What I think, what's not a great sign is that, neither side can actually agree to where to hold the summit or where to hold the talks. So, and I found it slightly weird.
There are no neutral nations anymore easily, are there? That's part
there
of the
are
challenge.
none. So was it Vladimir Putin, I believe, suggested Belarus, which I thought was bold of him, as an opening gambit. As Belarus is obviously where the Russian troops kind of amassed before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So it's really not a kind of, neutral territory. So I think Turkey is trying to kind of, shape itself, build itself up as the person or the people who can talk to both sides. We'll see if that happens. For some reason, the Vatican, apparently, the Vatican has been suggested, which, as you may imagine, Putin was not thrilled by. I don't believe, Lavrov will be going anywhere near the Vatican. So anyway, the one I found quite intriguing, actually, is apparently some unnamed African nations have kind of offered themselves up, which actually wouldn't be, I think, the worst idea in the world. You were saying that there were no kind of neutral nations left, but I think some of them on the African continent are still kind of not really taking a side. So maybe that could be the way forward.
Justin, it is a strange aspect to all of this that we are on the one hand talking ceasefire, on the other hand talking summer offensives. What does that look like to you? Does either side have any kind of upper hand right now?
I mean, not evidently. And one of the things that's interesting that's been going on in the background is obviously you've had a degree of a pause dictated by the weather in the fighting over the colder months. But what has not paused is the sort of technological race between the two of them, specifically around drone production, which I think most analysts think may be the thing that tips things one way or another there. And you've essentially got sort of two lines converging on a graph between the lethality and efficacy of these drones and then the price point at which they can be produced. And they're saying, Russia is cranking this up to somewhere in the region of 500 drones per day. I think Ukraine is matching them pretty closely. It was notable as well that while at least a degree of ceasefire was sort of in the ether and being discussed, most of Ukraine's drone activity into Russia ceased. That picked up again this week. I think Monday morning there was quite a significant attack where they hit a military chemicals manufacturing site, and this was 900 kilometres inside Russia. So while I think a lot of the talk has been that Ukraine has to some degree been on the back foot, often because of external factors, they are still exhibiting this ability to reach at, with limited resources, very little budget, and not much more than ingenuity. I mean, they are striking deep, deep into Russian territory there still.
They are striking deep into territory, despite the fact, Marie, that we've had these various bits of controversies in Europe about whether they should be striking into Russian territory. Volodymyr Zelensky was in Berlin. Friedrich Merz, the German chancellor, has had to kind of walk back his comments about whether Ukraine can fully strike, but at the same time has been showing support for Ukraine. There's been a number of military deals, a deal for long-range missile production. What have you made of Europe's efforts to still, in this kind of environment, support the military effort?
Well, I think what a lot of kind of nation states are getting a bit worried about is, whether they still have the buy-in, I think, of the electorate, of all the people. And I think especially when there's been such a wave against kind of incumbents at various elections last year, or just in general since the pandemic. So, how do you kind of keep your people on side while still, kind of sending a lot of money to Ukraine at a time when actually, a lot of countries in Europe and elsewhere are not doing tremendously economically. And then obviously you do have places like Hungary kind of trying to pull the rug their own side, at kind of EU level, etc. So I don't think it's sort of going terribly, but it certainly doesn't feel the kind of early months, I think, of the kind of beginning of the war, where it really felt like kind of all of Europe was properly standing behind Ukraine, Kiev, Zelensky. That I think that they're slightly running out of breath. But Zelensky keeps, I think, playing his cards quite well, though. I think his insistence at kind of saying, actually, we really do want the US in the room for any talks. We really want the US to be present, I think. It is quite blatantly trying to suck up to Trump. But as we know, that works quite well, usually.
And you've got to say,
he's looking elsewhere as well.
In terms of diplomacy, given, it feels like 100 years ago, but then the incident with Zelensky in the White House, that is only about 5 weeks ago. Oh, wow. And it's insane. It's so recent. And I think the way that
you could say that about so many things with the Trump administration. Only 5 weeks feels like
time is.
I've aged about several years, I think.
Time is concertinaed very strangely at the moment. But if you look at the way that the fact that there is even still a working relationship between Zelensky's office and the White House, and the scenes we saw at the Pope's funeral, and that at least for this week, this may have changed by the time the show goes out. Trump seemed to be more in the frame of mind of, I can't believe Putin has been misleading me all this time. You've got to chalk that up. That's a remarkable feat of diplomacy on Zelensky's part, I think.
It is an impressive feat of diplomacy, although, as you say, we don't know how long it will hold. But Marie, what have you made of the tensions between US and Russia right now? You were commenting earlier that we've now heard from Medvedev in Russia as well, suggesting Russia's not particularly happy with this change of tone from Trump.
No, so I think Trump's comments as well had quite a dire effect on the Russian economy. And the Russian economy was not doing sort of amazingly to begin with. But no, so Medvedev posted on X, which I think he quite likes doing. He's a real Russian poster. But he said, regarding Trump's words about Putin, I quote, playing with fire, and I quote, really bad things happening to Russia, I only know of one, capital letters, really bad thing, World War III. I hope Trump understands this, which is quite pleasantly mental. So I do think it's a slightly weird kind of, thing where both sides are really prone to going online and talking like sort of, teenagers who've had several cans of Red Bull. It's slightly worrying, I would say, as, someone who's part from the rest of the world and who's hoping we don't go into any kind of nuclear sort of...
It is ever so slightly worrying because, of course, just teenagers with, nuclear weapons and all of that stuff. Justin, do you feel like there is also from Trump's side, might there be now a determination to actually put some of these words and these tweets that he's, that he's talked about Vladimir Putin into actual action?
I think it largely depends on whoever was the last person who spoke to Trump. And, to the best of my reading, that is what dictates much of what he comes out with. The last thing he saw on TV, or woke up and was playing on Fox News at 3:00 in the morning, but that said, I think he appears to have the kind of mindset where he is very, very used to just saying what he wants and things getting done. And this was always the shark under the boat through his whole electoral campaign, is saying, I will sort X problem out in 24 hours. Well, if those people don't want, people have their own agency, and if other countries don't want to go along with those plans, it doesn't leave them with a great deal of wriggle room there. So there is scope. I think there are things being talked about in terms of much more stringent sanctions that could still be turned on the the Russian economy. I think at this stage they're more around things like, global banking systems and SWIFT and things like that, rather than the restriction of goods, because I think, barring several workarounds, I think most of those avenues have been closed off already to them. But there may be more thumbscrews that the Americans can tighten.
Well, let's move on to Australia, where the backstabbing among an opposition that lost an election it should have won appears to have ended after Labour's Anthony Albanese was once again elected Prime Minister of Australia. The Liberal National Coalition that had tried and failed to unseat him this year announced that it was splitting in two. Now, just a week later, they say their coalition has been revived. Justin, I'll start with you on this one. The Australian Liberals are liberal in the European sense of the word. Libertarian would be, I think, the word in the US, which always gets confusing when we talk about political parties. But we're talking here about two conservative parties of different ilks.
They are that, which is not to say that their differences are not, profound and deeply held. But I think it's an interesting example that across all kinds of stories we cover on here, we're talking a lot about the rise of particularly right-wing parties and a degree of populism, but less about what you're also seeing in a lot of these countries, which is a degree of sort of fracturing of traditional party systems. And, certainly in the UK, we focus a lot on, we're way too much on Farage and Reform, but you're also seeing, the rise of the Greens, more MPs sitting as independents. Marie's home country, France, obviously, was the trailblazer in all this. It's something we now think of Macron as a very establishment figure, but, when En Marche arrived, that completely broke what was a fairly traditional, more left-wing leaning, but a sort of left-right system in France. And I think there's a feeling that electorates don't entirely know how to deal with this in countries where there hasn't been a tradition of coalition and collegiate government. And I think, the case in Australia, I think, is about, parties needing to get better at working together. They do have a long-standing relationship going back over several decades, those two parties. But as much as I think parties need to get better at that sort of like fractional sort of like collaboration, you also think the voters probably need to get more realistic about what coalition government actually means for them. And in terms of, I'm not going to come out here and particularly make a case for the coalition years in the government, but a lot of what, say the Liberals got attacked for when they're into coalition with the Tories, you're like, well, that's sort of the point of being in coalition, is you can't do everything you said you were going to do when you thought it was just going to be you in charge. And I feel like there's sort of a gulf between how parties are having to arrange these things and how much voters actually understand the reality of them.
How voters understand it, but also when you look particularly at conservatives at this point, Marie, conservatism has changed when you look at so many different parties, obviously in the US as well, with Donald Trump, the sort of takeover of the Republican Party. It is a different ideology, effectively. And I do wonder, you look at an Australian example like this, in Europe, we are more used to this, aren't we? There's always been two sides to the right. There's been the traditional conservatives and the far right.
Yes, well, I mean, I guess it sort of depends. I think Britain was definitely a bit of an exception for quite a long time, and that, you definitely had sort of UKIP generally kind of, in the background, but that's a fairly recent phenomenon. Whereas, I mean, France is a slightly weird one. I think it was just Le Pen, first father, then daughter. Now, we just had this one family. We didn't really have a far right. That was established. We just had some guy who then had kids, which is a slightly weird way of doing politics. But I mean, the Australian things, I'm going to be honest, saying this may be shocking, but I'd not been following incredibly closely the kind of coalition talks between the two parties. But what I did find interesting is that apparently one of the big sticking points was on was on kind of climate and energy. And I think that is actually a really interesting thing, because that's not, and we've kind of seen that in Britain as well, where I think the Conservatives for quite a long time were actually pro net zero, had quite stringent sort of, ambitious plans on the kind of climate crisis. And then the far right kind of came in and said, rubbish to all that, we don't really care. And I think, and the Tories are kind of moving to the right on that now. And I think that's happened obviously with the Republicans as well. So clearly I think green issues have become one of those big sort of cleaving, I think, topics between the kind of right and the far right, with a slight worrying thing, I would say, that the kind of more mainstream traditional right more often than not ends up being the one caving and kind of going for the further right position and not the other way around.
It is an interesting point, Justin, that this is part of the problem that the right has, isn't it? Because the traditional conservatives did have a number of issues. Climate is a big one. Trade is actually another one. Conservatives tended to be more pro-free trade, and now you're having these supposed conservatives come in. But in many ways, the populist conservative side of many of these parties, they're stealing from both sides, aren't they? Some things are more sort of left when it comes to trade in particular. So It's not easy to keep this together, is it?
No, and I don't think it's overstating the point to say I think we are living through a profoundly counter-revolutionary moment. And I think in all kinds of countries we are seeing what appeared to be settled ideological positions for certainly my entire life, my adult life certainly, have essentially been upended. And I think without oversimplifying to some degree, I think what you've really seen on the right and to some degree on the left, but less so, is not just an ideological split, but a split between people who are based in ideologically held viewpoints and people who are just in vibes. And it's sort of vibes via ideology. And I think Trump is obviously the greatest example of that, where essentially he could propose anything as a policy platform now.
It's and personality.
Yeah, it would just be the way he sold it. And I think we had a harbinger of that when they were going through the nomination process for the Republican Party, where he essentially just didn't put up a policy platform. And essentially at that point they say, well, if, l'état c'est moi, and it's like whatever he says will become the writ of the party and the policy. And I think to greater and lesser degrees you are seeing that. I mean, certainly with Farage this week, a number of the things he suggested around, okay, we're going to raise this sort of tax bracket, we're going to get rid of the child poverty cap. And it's like, it's just pulling ideas out of thin air. But as long as they come through the conduit of that one particular politician, a number of people will fall in behind them. So I think ideologically, it's completely upended, I think, most of what we've known for my entire lifetime.
At the same time, Marie, as a final word on this, that word Justin mentioned earlier about compromise, that's also something that's being lost here, isn't it? Parties don't really want to engage in coalitions anymore with each other. They're very stuck in their ideologies, certainly no more than anywhere but in France.
Yes, well, I think I may go against that slightly. That I think I would argue that it's nearly the opposite. Where actually, we're ending up with so many kind of quite unwieldy, unworkable coalitions as a mean of opposing whoever's in power. So I think in France we had definitely, a coalition that
you
essentially
have the anti-coalition. That's true. You don't have the governing coalition, but we're very good at anti-coalitions.
Yes, but we're kind of 1 degree from the centre to the left, all the way to the communists, and predictably that completely collapsed. And I was reading, as one does, about Bulgaria recently, in Bulgarian politics, because I know how to have fun. And they have this quite sort of like grandiose coalition of 5 different parties, including until recently the Pirates Party, but because they had this kind of populist right figure in power, and they were just trying to go, well, everyone else, let's get together. And so I think that's what keeps happening actually in countries, of people going, oh gosh, how do we oppose whoever's in power? Let's all band together. And then they kind of get surprised when obviously it doesn't work out. I mean, Germany arguably as well had a kind of similar-ish situation. So I would say no, it is the age of the unwieldy coalition.
Unwieldy coalition, just about, maybe, sticking together. Well, now to important news from the world of civil aviation, because Turkish authorities have announced that they're taking on the scourge of plane passengers getting up out of their seats to try and disembark before it's their turn. In a bid to restore order to flight travel, any traveler who crowds the aisle before their turn faces a $70 fine. Apparently, the glares of other passengers was not enough to get them back in the seats. Marie, I have to say, I'm kind of with the Turkish authorities on this one. I do personally get annoyed when I see somebody wander into the aisle from behind so that I can't get my suitcases out. I'm sensing this isn't a scourge for you.
Marie's face makes me think something happened on that flight home from Rome.
No, it's just that it is potentially possible that perhaps just maybe I might be one of those people.
Oh,
no,
okay.
So not always.
You might face the fine.
No, but so in my defence, I think anything that has to do with kind of airports and flying and planes in general, there are very much two types of people, and I think there are efficient people and people who apparently is their first day of being alive, and they're still trying to get to grips with it.
First travel ever as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, not even just travel. Like they're just kind of
Just
like a
first
baby,
day.
just brought into human form, and was no. So I think that's why I like that. Yeah, I'm making the case for the defence here, which is that it is quite annoying, and I mean it doesn't help that I'm quite addicted to nicotine as well. So I think when I want to leave a flight, I want to leave a flight. But people who seemingly have kind of all the time in the world and they've forgotten how to stand up and where's my suitcase? And I can see them, I can spot them a mile off. So yes, if I can tell that some of them will be in my way, I will try and kind of stand up and go side of them. And I stand my ground. That is who I am as a person.
Justin, are you going to take the defence on this as well?
Well, I thought there was more to this story than met the eye. Maybe some of our Turkish listeners may be able to sort of colour us in on this. But when I read the actual piece, the proposal was specifically to find people who are moving into the aisle before the plane is stationary. So while the plane is still moving around.
At very early stage,
And
where you're kind of moving up already.
And I should say, to caveat this, I've spent the last 3 years working for a big travel company. I've been on planes endlessly. I don't think I've seen this happen once. So is this specifically a Turkish issue, that people are getting up and wandering around on Turkish Airlines before the plane has come to a halt? Because I'm sceptical that it's that much of a problem.
There is that good point, because there's this notes in here that it's sort of passengers must remain seated. But this is the question. The question is whether passengers must remain seated even after the seatbelt sign has been turned off. This is where they want to extend the time that you must remain in your seat, which I think, Marie, it sounds
in
like
which
would
case,
drive
call
you
me
crazy.
Spartacus. I'm not. No. If the plane has stopped moving, it is my God-given right to stand up and get my stuff and get the hell out of there.
I would say to, before Marie completely declares war on all air travellers.
No, on Turkey.
Just on Turkey. I should say one thing I did think was unfair. They said there were also proposals to extend the fine to people who are trying to board before they're called at the gate. Now, I do have some sympathy for this, because I don't think I've been through a single airport, some of the world's best airports. When you get to the gate, it is invariably absolute chaos. Things are badly signposted, queues aren't clear, they make an announcement which is completely indecipherable over a tannoy, and you're like, well, was that my bit? Was that someone else's call to board? So I think fining people because they've accidentally boarded a little too early is basically a shakedown for money, I'm saying.
See, I'm probably going to take the defence on that one too, but if only because in my personal experience, also as a tall guy, which listeners obviously will not know, I don't need to board early a plane. I'm probably with you, Marie, in your case, the nicotine, in my case, I just want to sit in a seat with a nice amount of legroom before I board. So anyone who wants to crowd the front and get to the boarding early, have at it.
Little humble brag from Chris there that he only travels in business class.
No. I'm the last one to board. That is my point. I wait, I sit just at the gate and I just relax for as long as I want, and I'm about the last person to get on
Same.
the plane.
I'm also 6'4", and that's a problem I have very often.
It's like being with the Harlem Globetrotters. Isn't it? I would say I do think we should be able to extend a on-the-spot fine to anyone who applauds when a plane lands, because that is the most basic behaviour known to man.
No, that's fair.
That is a rough one. Do you have any others, Marie? Any particular pet peeves from the travellers?
Yes, a very specific one, which is I feel like most airports these days have a kind of fast food place, so Burger King, McDonald's, whatever. People who get fast food to eat on the plane, I think, and I don't matter, eat by all means, but surely eat cold food or food that you got given from the kind of flight attendants. I think a kind of clearly cold Burger King has that very specific kind of cold burger smell, which is just not what I want on a flight.
A friend of mine once sat next to a woman on a flight to Spain who just after takeoff opened a bag of prawns and just ate them next to him. Yeah.
No.
2 bags of prawns.
And now they're together. It's been 10 beautiful years.
How I Met Your Mother.
The other thing I'm just going to say to end on this, it's interesting that we're talking only about passengers, because I'm sure we also have our pet peeves about airlines, and one that is related to this for me is the airlines that force you to check in at the gate and then stand because you can't actually get into the plane itself yet. It's not ready for embarking. I think the airlines should be fined too.
I had this in Phoenix last year where they had actually announced my name on the tannoy and said I had to go to the gate. And I was like, God, have I completely misread the time? Did I not set my watch correctly? Sprinted through Phoenix Airport, which if any listeners know it, is basically a long running track, and got there having a bit of a nervo, at which when they went, no, we just wanted to get everyone here early.
Exactly. It's
Sat there for an hour and a half after
traveling right now, does it not, Marie? Sometimes it feels like the airlines just want you to be there early, extremely orderly, because they have to meet their margins.
I don't know. So weirdly, I find it and I know I'm in a small minority on this. I find airports quite soothing as long as I'm by myself. So I've got my headphones on. I will buy a very large fizzy drink that I will drink very slowly, or maybe a large iced coffee. Maybe I'll go to a shop, buy some earrings from Accessorize for £7 with not a hint of metal in them.
Massive
I have a
Toblerone.
nice time. Yeah, no, it's just I quite like an airport, so I actually don't really mind.
It's a nice time. Well, finally, for our panel, if you have made it off your plane through the unruly passengers and you find yourself arriving at a hotel in South Korea, you may have noticed something of a new trend when you wake up the next morning, because the breakfast buffet is no longer the purview of hotel guests alone. You could find yourself nursing a coffee and pastry next to a group of active seniors who have taken to using hotel buffets as social gatherings. Indeed, weekly hotel breakfasts for groups of seniors are apparently becoming a thing. Justin, you have personal experience of this, I understand.
I do.
You're just so old.
Yeah, how many weekly
I'm
hotel
Korean
gatherings have
and
you been
also
joining?
naughty. It's amazing how I was.
Okay, not quite that experience, but you have some experience.
I do.
You've been
I can.
so, and you've
Yeah.
been following this trend to a degree.
I can
The
attest.
fascination with the breakfast buffet.
It's a real thing. So I was in Seoul and Jeju last year, which is the small volcanic island just off the south of South Korea. It's like the Korean answer to Hawaii. It's a very popular holiday destination. And I was interviewing a bunch of hotel general managers. And I was saying, what's the key thing that sort of drives people to your resort? And by the third time, and one of them said, it's the breakfast buffet. And at first I thought, this must just be like a weird local oddity. And then the third one was like, no. Guests will spend months researching online the equivalent sort of quality, size of the offering, range of the food. And on the first day we went down for breakfast at the hotel in Jeju, and this place was, I would say, the size, probably twice the size of the food court in Selfridges. I mean, it was insane. And it was sort of regionally stacked out. So there was obviously you have a lot of Chinese tourism there. So there was sort of very traditional Chinese breakfasts, lots of regional Korean food, slightly sad, depressing kind of Western bit with some bread and cheese or whatever, but everything else, and it's
continent.
Well, and it's quite heavy stuff, sort of Korean breakfast foods. There is a lot of sea abalones and broths and loads of sort of chili and kimchi and fermented goods, and just people are in there for hours, and they really do take this stuff incredibly seriously.
I mean, when you put it like that, Justin, Marie, I mean, surely then, why would you even want to stay overnight in a hotel? Just go to the buffet.
No, I will be leaving the studio and flying to Seoul into a... Now, I love a breakfast buffet with sort of every fibre of my being as well. And that's still even the, slightly rubbish ones in Britain with, the kind of really rubbery eggs and horrible sausages.
You're still in your element.
I'm still so happy. I'm still so happy.
I have seen Marie leaving a travel lodge with hash browns in her handbag, just stuffed full of them.
Oh, I see. So it's not just about the breakfast buffet itself. You're
I like a hotel.
Preparing yourself for the day.
Hotel breakfast experience. I don't know. It's something that it does feel like a tiny holiday in itself.
I have to say, Justin, it's also not so different from going to a hotel's cocktail lounge was sort of the example that I thought of, with people kind of going into the breakfast buffet. Why not make use of a hotel's amenities?
and I think there's something really nice, sort of slightly more serious hospitality point, is that often, particularly in places like hotels, early mornings are a slightly neglected part of the day, because it's generally when you're just doing the changeover in service, you've got the cleaners in, whatever. But they're often not. These places are really, really beautiful spaces. Often they look their best in the morning when they're not so busy. And I think, if you can find some of the hotels in any of the major cities that really excel at breakfast, going out on your own for breakfast is such a bougie move as well. I think going out for dinner on your own is nice, but going for breakfast on your own, getting properly dressed up, go somewhere smart. The Wolsey or something. The Wolsey breakfast is always great. Going there by yourself, great start to the day. But I think the Koreans are possibly leading the curve on this one, and I would say in a year or two it'll be more commonplace in other places.
Well, speaking of the South Koreans leading, Marie, just finally, I have in my notes here that this does follow on from France's vacances trend. They're comparing it to that, the idea that you would stay in a hotel in the city that you live in for a little special night out, special evening out. Have you ever thought of doing that? Staycation as well, in a hotel.
That sounds like trying to sort of rebrand the concept of the affair. Like, it's not I just really love staying in a hotel room where I live for no particular reason. It's a French thing. You wouldn't understand.
Yeah.
Like,
Marie, having worked in hotels, I can say there are all kinds of legitimate reasons why people might want to book a hotel room for 2 hours in the afternoon. Maybe they've just got a Zoom call.
Your Honour.
I'm really glad we cleared that up for both of you. Marie Leconte and Justin Quirk, thank you for joining us. And finally, on today's show, for years, Nicola Kelly worked in the United Kingdom at the heart of Downing Street in the Home Office on the unfolding refugee crisis gripping the country. In her role as a diplomat, she came face to face with policies and politics in tackling the problem. She documented those experiences in a new book, Anywhere But Here: How Britain's Broken Asylum System Fails Us All. Andrew Muller joined her to discuss it and began by asking how difficult it was to find people willing to talk.
Asylum seekers themselves, it wasn't too difficult to find. What I wanted to do, and I had a really clear idea of the sort of demographics that I wanted. So I wanted a sort of geographical spread, so people that had come from lots of different countries. But also I didn't want asylum seekers' voices that were solely single males who had crossed, because I didn't want to feed into that narrative. So I wanted a family, I wanted a single female who'd crossed, a single male, etc. So it wasn't too difficult to find those people. And I basically went about it by going to northern France quite a lot. So I went to northern France and met people at the point of departure and then followed them as they made their way across the Channel, arrived in Britain and began to navigate the asylum system. Lots of people, I had leads from those trips to northern France. And I, handed out my contact details, and lots of people got back in touch when they reached Britain, but some people didn't. So I probably had about half the number of people that I got in touch with when I was in northern France kept in touch with me, and others sort of dropped off the radar. So that's asylum seekers. And then people on the front line, that was slightly trickier. So I have a Home Office official in there. That was particularly tricky. I used to work at the Home Office, so I have lots of friends and former colleagues who were there. But they're obviously under, instructions and sometimes under duress not to speak. So that was slightly more complicated. And then other officials, like a Coast Guard, for example, who works on the Kent coast and sort of coordinates search and rescue missions in the Channel, that was also a little bit tricky. So quite a mixed bag. But yeah, when it came to officials, it was slightly trickier, but asylum seekers.
Is it frustrating to you, though, that more reporting of this issue isn't like that? Because, as you know, asylum seekers tend to get reported, certainly in the United Kingdom, as just this vast, undifferentiated, vaguely threatening mass, rather than individuals with their own stories and own reasons and own quirks.
Yeah, and I suppose there is that narrative of asylum seekers are just a lump, it's just a lump term, and it's just a homogenous group of people. So I really wanted to sort of bring out some of those individual stories. I suppose it is a source of frustration that that those stories don't get heard all that often, because there's a lot to learn about the world and about foreign policy as well as domestic policy from hearing those stories. Yeah, it was something I definitely wanted to do, was to draw out the backgrounds of those people, the circumstances from which they had fled, but also what they were experiencing once they arrived in Britain, because I think so much had been written, and I've certainly read lots of books about the well-trodden migration route through Europe, but comparatively little is known about what actually happens when people reach Britain and begin to navigate the asylum system. So I wanted to draw out some of those individual experiences to sort of illustrate those points.
As you mentioned, you do also come at this from somebody who has seen the process from the other side, i.e. working at the Home Office. And for all the good intentions of some people who may work there, the portrait of the Home Office that comes across in your book is not entirely flattering, to say the very least. Do you think it is actually the right institution to deal with this issue, or is there an argument for trying to set up some entirely separate structure?
That's a discussion that's been going on for some time, I think, internally, across Whitehall, but internally, about whether the Home Office itself needs reform. Culturally, we know it needs reform. Like in the wake of Windrush, there was the Wendy Williams report, and there was a lot of discussion then about it being an institutionally racist department, was the exact language used in that report. So culturally, people know that something needs to change. But yeah, the discussion about whether the immigration functions themselves are broken off from the Home Office so that the Home Office then would, as it were, just deal with policing, counter-terrorism, security issues. And then there will be a completely separate department for immigration, so borders, passports, etc., as well as the asylum system, is a conversation that's very live. And I think it's a conversation that's very much still being had. And it's not many people, officials themselves, think that it would be feasible to do that. And the Home Office, once upon a time, about 10, maybe 15 years ago, looked after prisons as well. And then the MOJ was broken off, obviously, and that looks after prisons now. So there is a precedent for doing it. It will be interesting to see whether that ever sees the light of day. But yeah, it's a conversation that's certainly still being had.
Do you think there is something fundamentally peculiar about the British approach, certainly when compared to other European countries? And this may be a function of Britain as an island nation, because I do think islanders tend to look at the world in a slightly different way, because there is this performative aspect, as your book notes, to the way that British governments respond to it, with the obvious example being the now abandoned Rwanda scheme, which seemed like the archetypal example of the politician's fallacy. Something must be done. This is something, therefore we must do it. Do you get the impression that there is anything from other European countries that could be learned by the United Kingdom?
Yeah, in answer to the first part of your question, I don't think it's completely unique in that Italy has got a deal with Albania. They're very focused on externalization. Greece is, very often in the headlines for the ways in which it deals with asylum seekers. And the second part, I think, where France and Germany are concerned, they receive typically triple the number of asylum applications that the UK receives and processes them in a fraction of the time, because Germany has about 10,000 asylum decision makers. They're all highly trained. They are, recompensed for their work, recognised for it, and it's considered to be really valued, high-skilled work. Our asylum decision makers, by comparison, are completely, I write in the book about lots of them being recruited from major supermarkets, Aldi, Tesco, McDonald's as well, and some of them are referring to Lonely Planet guides for potted histories of the countries from which the asylum seeker in front of them has fled, because they know so little about the context, which is quite a worrying state of affairs. So I think there's probably something to be learned about certainly about the processing and the asylum decision makers and the decisions that get made from countries like Germany and France.
Nicola Kelly there speaking with Andrew Muller. Nicola's book, Anywhere But Here, How Britain's Broken Asylum System Fails Us All, is out now. That's all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. A big thanks to my panellists, Marie Lecomte and Justin Quirk. Today's show was produced by Tom Webb, researched by Francesca Jilks, and our sound engineer was Elliot Greenfield. I'm Chris Chermak here in London. The Monocle Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.